August 4th, 1962. Inside a quiet home in Brentwood, Marilyn Monroe is found dead, lying face down on her bed, a phone still in her hand. The bedroom door is locked from the inside. At first, it looks like a tragic ending. But then, the questions begin. The timeline of that night isn't perfectly clear. The people closest to her give accounts that don't fully align. And even after official investigations, doubts refuse to disappear. Because in a case like this, it's not just what happened, it's what still doesn't make sense. She was the most famous woman in the world. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a Hollywood star. She was a global icon whose films made millions and whose image defined an entire era of fame and obsession. But behind that image was a woman dealing with pressure, emotional struggle, and dependence on powerful medication. By 1962, everything was starting to fall apart. Then came the night that changed everything. According to verified historical report, Marilyn Monroe was found dead on August 5th, 1962, lying face down with a telephone in her hand, with empty pill bottles nearby, and her death was officially ruled a probable suicide caused by an overdose. But even with that conclusion, the case didn't end. Because over time, questions about the timeline, the events, and the final hours continued to surface, keeping the mystery alive for decades. So now the question is no longer just how she died. The real question is, what are we still missing?
One of the most famous stars in Hollywood history is dead at 36. Marilyn Monroe was found dead in bed.
On the basis of all the information obtained, it is our opinion that the case is a probable suicide.
No, it was not a suicide. Marilyn Monroe was murdered. There's no question about it.
Christopher Oggiati examines her mysterious death and the dark forces that surrounded her in the last months of her life. Say goodbye to the president.
You kind of get a happiness too, because there's so many fans remembering her, that you kind of feel happy that she's still being remembered.
Miss Monroe played in 23 films since her debut in 1950, and she was the idol of the GIs, the animation of Foxhole Dreams.
The events surrounding Marilyn Monroe's death were completely covered up by the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, and top officials governing Los Angeles County.
Now, another chance to see BBC One's award-winning investigation into the death of Marilyn Monroe, who was found dead at her home in Los Angeles 30 years ago.
This should not be a closed case. It should be an open case by the DA. There's too many people, too much overwhelming evidence that proves that this was not a suicide.
As a matter of fact, she's a special angel to me, and she should be to you, because even though she's gone, she isn't.
Marilyn Monroe was not born into fame or stability. She entered the world as Norma Jean, a child surrounded by uncertainty, growing up between foster homes, never experiencing a consistent sense of belonging. That unstable beginning shaped her deeply. Even when she became the most recognizable woman on earth, the emotional wounds from her childhood never fully healed, quietly influencing her thoughts, decisions, and relationships throughout her life. From the outside, she represented perfection. Cameras loved her presence, audiences adored her performances, and studios depended on her image to generate massive profits across the global film industry during her peak years. But behind that image existed a completely different reality, one filled with anxiety, emotional vulnerability, and a constant need for reassurance that fame could never truly satisfy, no matter how powerful it appeared. According to documented historical records, Marilyn Monroe rose to international fame during the 1950s, becoming one of Hollywood's most successful and influential actresses of her time. Despite achieving global recognition, her internal struggles intensified. She faced chronic insomnia, often unable to sleep for extended periods, leading to emotional exhaustion that affected both her mental state and professional performance. To cope with this, she relied on medication. Doctors prescribed sedatives to help her sleep and stimulants to keep her active, creating a cycle that slowly increased her dependence over time. As this dependence grew, her control over daily life began to weaken. The The substances that once helped her function gradually became necessary, making it difficult for her to maintain stability without them. Now, consider something important. When a person begins relying on substances just to feel normal, how much control do they truly have over their own decisions and emotional responses? Her professional life began to reflect these struggles. She frequently arrived late to film sets, sometimes missing entire days, and occasionally struggled to remember lines, frustrating directors and increasing production delays. These issues were not a result of lack of talent. Instead, they were symptoms of a deeper internal battle that few people in the industry fully understood or took seriously at the time. Her personal life also began to collapse. Her marriage to Arthur Miller ended in divorce in 1961, removing one of the last sources of emotional stability she had in her life. At the same time, her career faced unexpected setbacks. Her film The Misfits, released in 1961, failed to perform as expected, adding pressure to an already fragile emotional state. This combination of personal and professional decline created a dangerous environment. Success was fading, support systems were weakening, and her internal struggles were becoming more intense than ever before. Instead of moving forward, she was forced to pause. Much of 1961 was spent dealing with serious health issues, including surgeries and extended hospital stays that further impacted her mental condition. At one point, she was admitted to a psychiatric facility due to severe depression. This experience left a lasting emotional impact, reinforcing feelings of isolation and vulnerability that she already carried. Think about that moment carefully. How does someone go from being admired by millions to feeling completely alone, even when surrounded by people who claim to support them? By late 1961, she returned to Los Angeles and purchased a home in Brentwood, hoping it would provide a sense of peace and a fresh start away from the pressures of her previous environment. On the surface, it seemed like a positive change. A new home often represents a new beginning, a chance to rebuild life and regain control over circumstances that previously felt overwhelming. But internally, the same struggles remained unresolved. Changing location does not automatically heal emotional wounds, especially when those wounds have been developing over many years. In early 1962, she attempted to restart her career by working on a new film, Something's Got to Give, which was expected to mark her return to success. However, her ongoing health issues caused repeated delays in production. The studio grew frustrated, and despite medical confirmation of her condition, she was publicly criticized for being unreliable and unprofessional. That public criticism mattered deeply, because reputation in Hollywood spreads quickly, and once it begins to decline, it can reshape how everyone in the industry perceives a person's value and reliability. Eventually, she was removed from the project and faced legal action from the studio. This moment represented more than a career setback, it was a direct hit to her identity. Yet despite everything, she did not completely give up. In the weeks leading up to her death, she made visible efforts to rebuild her image and reconnect with opportunities. She gave interviews, re-established professional relationships, and began discussing potential future roles, suggesting that she was planning a return to the spotlight despite her ongoing struggles. From the outside, this looked like recovery, but internally, the same instability, dependence, and emotional vulnerability were still present, creating a situation where appearances did not reflect reality. And that contrast becomes critical, because when someone appears to be improving while still facing deep internal struggles, the outcome can become unpredictable and difficult to understand from the outside. Now the story begins to move towards something much more specific. A single day that would later be examined in detail, with every moment analyzed for meaning and significance. At the time it seemed ordinary, but when viewed later, every call, every visit, and every decision begins to feel like part of something far more important than anyone realized. So now consider this carefully. If everything appeared normal on the surface, what warning signs were hidden beneath that no one fully recognized until it was too late? Because what happened in her final hours did not begin that night. It was building over time, quietly, step by step, leading toward a moment that would shock the entire world. August 4, 1962 began without any visible warning signs that history was about to record one of the most mysterious deaths in Hollywood. Inside her Brentwood home, everything appeared controlled and routine. That calm surface matters, because when a story later turns into a mystery, the most unsettling truth is often how normal everything looked before something irreversible suddenly happened without clear explanation. During the morning, Marilyn Monroe stayed inside her home, handling conversations and small personal tasks. A photographer visited, and discussions related to her professional life continued without any immediate sign of crisis. She also received deliveries and maintained communication with people around her. These actions suggest she was still engaged in daily routines rather than withdrawing completely from the world around her. According to biography, Marilyn Monroe's final days showed a combination of emotional pressure, medication dependence, and attempts to rebuild her career, creating a fragile but active period before her death. Inside the house were individuals who would later become critical to understanding what happened. Her housekeeper Eunice Murray remained present, and her publicist Patricia Newcomb had been part of the day's earlier activity. At first, these details feel ordinary, but once the outcome is known, every presence, every decision, and every movement inside that house begins to carry more weight than it originally seemed. As the day progressed, her emotional condition remained unclear. Some accounts suggest she had not slept properly, while others describe her as communicative and still connected to ongoing plans. That contrast creates tension. Was she experiencing another unstable day? Or was she functioning normally while dealing with deeper struggles that were not immediately visible to the people around her? Later in the afternoon, her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, arrived for a therapy session. This visit followed her ongoing treatment, but what happened after the session would later become significant. After meeting with her, Greenson asked Newcomb to leave and instructed Murray to stay overnight. That instruction suggests there was concern about leaving Monroe alone during the night. Consider the implication. If someone close to her believed she needed supervision, then the situation was already serious before the final hours even began. As evening approached, Monroe continued interacting with people outside her home. She spoke with Joe DiMaggio Jr., and according to his account, she sounded calm and emotionally stable. That moment interrupts a simple narrative. If she sounded normal, then the transition from stability to death becomes harder to explain without examining what changed during the hours that followed. Not long after, she contacted her psychiatrist again. Reports indicate she was still communicating in a way that suggested she had not completely withdrawn from her surroundings. Then, something shifted. That shift is subtle in the timeline, but powerful in its effect. The day moves from routine activity into a sequence that becomes increasingly unclear and difficult to reconstruct precisely. Later that evening, Monroe went into her bedroom. At some point after, actor Peter Lawford called her, and his account described her voice as unusual and possibly affected by medication. That detail becomes critical, because when behavior changes suddenly, it often signals a turning point, even if that moment is not fully understood at the time it occurs. After that call, contact with her stopped. Attempts to reach her were unsuccessful, and the silence that followed became one of the most important gaps in the entire timeline. Time passed without immediate intervention. And when time stretches inside a mystery, it creates space for uncertainty, speculation, and questions that remain difficult to answer even after decades of investigation. Sometime after midnight, Murray noticed light still coming from under Monroe's bedroom door. She attempted to get a response, but received nothing, increasing concern about what might be happening inside. Instead of contacting authorities immediately, she reached out to Dr. Greenson. He arrived at the house and entered Monroe's room through a window before police were called. That sequence matters deeply. Why was a private individual contacted before law enforcement? And what actions took place inside the room before it became an official investigation scene? Inside the bedroom, Monroe was found lying on her bed, unresponsive. By the time authorities were notified, the situation had already passed through critical moments without official documentation. That delay has remained one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Because in investigations, the order of actions often determines how evidence is preserved, interpreted, and ultimately understood. By the time police arrived, Marilyn Monroe was already gone. But what followed did not bring immediate clarity. Instead, it opened a series of questions that would continue to grow over time. Because once investigators began examining the evidence, the timeline, and the witness accounts, the story shifted from tragedy into something far more complex. And that leads directly into the next phase. When facts are analyzed and conclusions are made, do they always answer questions or sometimes create even more? By the morning of August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe's death had already moved beyond a private tragedy. It became an official case, one that required explanation, documentation, and a clear conclusion. At first, investigators approached the scene with a straightforward assumption. A well-known actress, a history of emotional instability, and the presence of medication suggested a familiar outcome. But investigations are not built on assumptions alone. They rely on evidence. And in this case, the evidence would not only provide answers, but also introduce details that made the situation far more complex. According to History.com, Marilyn Monroe was found dead with empty pill bottles nearby, and her death was officially ruled a probable suicide caused by an overdose of barbiturates. The autopsy was conducted the same day. Deputy Coroner Thomas Noguchi examined her body to determine the exact cause of death, focusing on toxicology results, physical condition, and any signs of external involvement. The findings confirmed high levels of barbiturates in her system. Specifically, substances such as pentobarbital and chloral hydrate were detected in amounts significantly above what is considered a safe or survivable level. These drugs are powerful sedatives. In large quantities, they slow down the central nervous system, eventually stopping breathing entirely. The levels found suggested a rapid and overwhelming intake within a short period. From a medical perspective, this pointed toward overdose. But the deeper question remained. How did those substances enter her system in that quantity, and under what exact circumstances did that occur? Investigators also examined the physical condition of the room. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible injuries suggesting physical struggle. The bedroom door was locked, reinforcing the idea that she was alone during her final moments. At this stage, the official conclusion began to form. A locked room, high drug concentration, no signs of violence. These elements aligned with the classification of probable suicide. Yet even within that conclusion, details began to attract attention. One of the earliest concerns involved the speed of drug absorption. Some observers questioned whether such high levels could be consumed and processed so quickly without additional evidence appearing in expected areas. That question did not immediately change the conclusion, but it introduced doubt. And in a case like this, doubt does not disappear. It grows, especially when the subject is someone as globally recognized as Marilyn Monroe. Another detail involved the absence of a suicide note. While not unusual in many cases, its absence in a situation involving a high-profile individual led to further speculation about intent and circumstances. Consider the pattern. Evidence supports a conclusion, but small inconsistencies remain present within that same evidence. And when both exist together, the narrative becomes difficult to settle completely. Witness accounts also played a role. Statements from individuals inside the house were reviewed, compared, and analyzed to reconstruct the final hours leading to her death. However, these accounts were not identical. Differences in timing, perception, and recollection created variations that investigators had to interpret carefully when building the official timeline. These differences did not prove wrongdoing, but they prevented the timeline from feeling perfectly consistent. And consistency is critical in any investigation. Without it, even a medically supported conclusion can feel incomplete. Another layer involved her medical history. Her long-term dependence on sedatives meant her body responded differently to these substances compared to someone without that history. This factor was used to explain certain toxicological observations. But again, explanation does not always remove uncertainty. It simply offers one interpretation among several possible ways to understand the same set of facts. At this point, the official ruling was finalized. Marilyn Monroe's death was classified as a probable suicide caused by acute barbiturate poisoning. That decision was supported by medical findings, psychiatric history, and the absence of physical evidence suggesting external force. Yet something remained unresolved, because even after the ruling, questions did not disappear. Instead, they began to move beyond official reports and into public discussion. Why did certain details feel unclear? Why did the timeline leave gaps that could not be fully reconstructed with complete certainty? Why did witness accounts vary in ways that could not be perfectly aligned? These questions did not overturn the conclusion, but they prevented the case from achieving complete closure. And when closure is missing, interpretation begins. Different individuals, researchers, and journalists started examining the same evidence from different perspectives, searching for explanations that extended beyond the official ruling. Some focused on the medical aspects, others examined the timeline, and some looked at the people involved. Each approach attempted to answer the same question from a different angle, producing theories that would continue to evolve over decades. That is where the case begins to change. It moves from investigation into interpretation, from documented evidence into competing explanations. And once that shift happens, a story rarely returns to a single, uncontested version. So now the focus begins to move forward. Because when a case leaves behind unanswered questions, those questions create space for something else to emerge. Not just doubt, but alternative explanations that challenge the official narrative. And once those explanations begin to spread, the story transforms into something far larger than the original event itself. Marilyn Monroe's death did not remain a private tragedy for long. Very quickly, it became something larger, a case pulled into rumor, power, politics, and the public hunger for hidden explanations. That transformation matters because unresolved deaths do not stay still. They evolve. Every missing detail gains symbolic weight, and every inconsistency becomes a doorway through which theory, suspicion, and obsession quietly enter. In Monroe's case, the official ruling never stopped debate. It only redirected it. Instead of ending the story, the probable suicide conclusion became the very thing many doubters began trying to challenge. The first theories were not subtle. They suggested murder, deliberate silencing, and influence from powerful men whose names carried enough weight to keep suspicion alive for generations afterward. According to the Los Angeles Times, speculation grew so intensely that the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office reopened an investigation in 1982, 20 years after Monroe's death, to examine whether criminal conduct had occurred. That article anchor matters here because it confirms something crucial. The mystery was not sustained only by gossip. Public pressure became strong enough to trigger an official re-examination of the case itself. One of the most persistent theories centered on Monroe's reported connections to President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Those connections helped turn personal tragedy into political mythology. The logic behind that theory was simple and powerful. If Marilyn knew things that could embarrass influential men, then her death could be framed not as despair, but as elimination. That idea spread because it offers something audiences are drawn to instinctively, a hidden room explanation where fame, sex, politics, and secrecy collide inside one single death. Another stream of suspicion focused less on motive and more on procedure. Why were there delays in securing the scene? Why were some materials not preserved as carefully as expected? Those concerns mattered because procedure shapes trust. Once people believe evidence was handled poorly, they stop asking only what happened. They begin asking whether someone wanted certainty to remain impossible. The Los Angeles Times later described the original inquest as somewhat slapdash, noting delays in securing the scene and the disappearance of tissue samples, details that helped fuel later murder theories. That does not prove homicide, but it explains why the case never settled fully in the public imagination. A weakly handled investigation can keep suspicion alive even when official conclusions remain unchanged. By 1982, prosecutors revisited the case under mounting pressure. They reviewed the earlier findings, examined long-standing allegations, and looked directly at claims that Monroe had been murdered or deliberately silenced. Their conclusion did not support those claims. After roughly 3.5 months, investigators found the coroner's ruling reasonable and did not uncover evidence sufficient to justify a homicide prosecution. Yet even that review failed to quiet the story. In mysteries like this, official denials often do not close belief. They can deepen it by suggesting that institutions are protecting themselves. Another disturbing detail entered the public record later. The Los Angeles Police Department stated that the original file on Monroe's death had been destroyed in 1972 under a records purge regulation. That fact became explosive in the public imagination. For many people, destroyed records do not sound administrative. They sound intentional, even when officials say the destruction followed routine departmental policy. Police later released what they described as a nearly complete duplicate file, with portions censored for privacy. Even so, releasing records did not erase suspicion. It only shifted debate to what remained missing. And that shift is essential. Because once a mystery reaches the point where absence itself becomes evidence in the public mind, every missing page, censored line, or vanished sample starts feeling sinister. Some writers pushed the story further, suggesting organized crime involvement, covert pressure, or collusion among police, medical officials, and political insiders. Those claims gained attention because Monroe's fame amplified every dark possibility. But attention is not proof. And that is the line this case has never stopped balancing on. A documented death surrounded by procedural weaknesses, cultural obsession, and explanations dramatic enough to outlive evidence itself. So what remains after decades of theories? Not a solved conspiracy, not a fully settled tragedy. What remains is a death where uncertainty proved strong enough to become part of Marilyn Monroe's legacy. And that is why this chapter matters. The case stopped being only about how she died. It became about why the world still resists accepting any version completely. Marilyn Monroe's story did not end when her life ended. In many ways, that was the moment her image transformed from stardom into something larger, stranger, and far more permanent. Her death shocked audiences across America and far beyond it. Newspapers carried the story immediately, and public reaction was intense because people were not mourning only an actress. They were mourning an era. That distinction matters deeply. When an ordinary life ends, grief stays personal. When an icon dies under unresolved circumstances, grief expands into myth, and myth keeps returning whenever certainty begins to fade. In the years that followed, Monroe remained everywhere. Her films continued playing, her photographs remained instantly recognizable, and her face kept symbolizing glamour, vulnerability, fame, and tragic loneliness all at once. That kind of legacy is rare. Most celebrities are remembered for work. Marilyn Monroe was remembered for contradiction, because the world never stopped seeing both the public fantasy and the private pain inside the same image. Her funeral, arranged by Joe DiMaggio, carried a quieter sadness than the scale of her fame might suggest. The ceremony was private, restrained, and shaped more by grief than spectacle. And yet the silence around that farewell only made the mystery louder. The less closure people felt, the more her death seemed unfinished, and unfinished stories do not disappear. They settle into culture and wait. According to App News, Marilyn Monroe's Brentwood home, the place where she spent her final months and died in 1962, was declared a Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument in June 2024. That modern development is important for this chapter because it shows the case is not frozen in the past. The location itself still carries emotional, historical, and cultural weight today. A house becomes a monument only when society decides memory still matters. And in Monroe's case, that memory is not attached only to celebrity. It is attached to unanswered questions that still shape how her life is understood. Even now, people remain divided over the meaning of her final hours. Many accept the official conclusion of probable suicide. Others believe the case still contains gaps that resist complete confidence. That tension is exactly why the story survives. If the evidence had erased every doubt, the case would have become history. Instead, uncertainty turned it into a permanent cultural argument. There is also a more human reason this story endures. Marilyn Monroe represented a kind of fame that looked magical from a distance but could feel brutal from the inside. Her life keeps resonating because it exposes a painful truth. A person can be adored by millions, desired by the powerful, recognized everywhere, and still remain deeply vulnerable when the cameras stop and the room goes quiet. That is why her death still holds power after all these decades. It is not only a mystery about evidence, timelines, and witnesses, it is also a story about loneliness inside public worship. So after everything, what do we actually know? We know Marilyn Monroe died in the home she bought for herself. We know the official ruling remained probable suicide. And we know public doubt never fully disappeared. What remains beyond those facts is interpretation. Some see a tragic ending shaped by pain, dependence, and emotional exhaustion. Others see inconsistencies strong enough to keep suspicion alive indefinitely. But perhaps the deepest truth sits somewhere else. Perhaps Marilyn Monroe's story still matters because it reminds us that behind every icon is a person, and behind every legend there may be wounds the public never truly sees. That is why the mystery remains alive. Not because the world lacks theories, but because the world never stopped feeling that something about her life, her death, and her sadness was never fully resolved. Marilyn Monroe's story does not end with a clear answer. It ends with a question that has survived decades, investigations, and every attempt to explain what truly happened inside that Brentwood home. The official conclusion remains unchanged. Her death was ruled a probable suicide caused by barbiturate overdose. The evidence, the reports, and her personal struggles all support that explanation on record. But records do not always silence doubt. Because even after everything was documented, something about the timeline, the details, and the final hours never fully settled in the minds of people who studied this case. And that is where this story becomes something deeper. It stops being only about how she died, and becomes about why the truth still feels incomplete, even after decades of investigation and public discussion. Think about the contrast. A woman known across the world, desired, admired, followed everywhere. And yet, in her final moment, everything ended in silence inside a locked room. That image alone is difficult to ignore, because it forces a question beyond evidence. How does someone surrounded by millions still reach a moment of complete isolation? That is why this story continues to exist. Not just because of theories, not just because of unanswered details, but because it reflects something real about fame, pressure, and the human condition behind public image. So now, after everything you have heard, the question belongs to you. Do you believe this was a tragic decision shaped by personal struggle? Or do you feel that something within this case still does not fully align with the official explanation? That choice is what keeps this story alive. Because some cases are remembered for their answers, but others are remembered for the questions they leave behind. And Marilyn Monroe's death remains one of them. This case required extensive research, careful reconstruction of events, and deep analysis of historical records over many years. If you want to explore the full investigation, all sources will be available in the description. If you stayed until the end, it means you value truth beyond headlines. Subscribe now because the next story may challenge everything you believe even more than this one. Press the bell icon, stay connected, and become part of a community that looks deeper, questions harder, and refuses to ignore what others choose to overlook.